Okay, so Dave Rossi is going to share insights gathered from his research into metric manipulation and via mass, understanding time, vacuum extractability, and interferometry, and much more. Dave is the founder of SALT LLC, a company focused on providing solutions to various elements of consciousness, ZPE propulsion, potentially medical benefits, and much more. So let me see. Let me go to Mr. Dave Rossi, or Dave Zed, as he is known. He has a podcast. He is much more famous than I am. I'm not famous.
Well, first off, let me just say thank you so much, Tim, for everything that you've been doing. I've been very silently over the last probably 7-8 months, just jumping in. I'd like to give a shout out to Jeremy Riss as well. He's the reason that I was even able to jump into all this from the beginning. Ethan, sir, thank you so very much for your work. And to everyone here, honestly, I'm just very passionate about the pursuit of whether theoretically or in the laboratory that everyone has here. So what I'm about to show you guys, I'm going to share my screen and show you guys a video which is about just over 30 minutes. The reason it's a video is because truthfully I've presented a varied version of what you're about to see to multiple departments of the DoD, so I needed to get it approved, and this is the most that I could showcase publicly. I'm doing my absolute best to not just speak theoretically but also practically as well. And I agree with Tim on Ethan's work. Ethan, I really like that example, sir, of the sparking, rubbing your feet on the carpet and touching the doorknob and getting a spark. I really appreciate that, sir. So I'm going to mute myself now, and I will share my screen with my sound and begin the presentation.
Am I still on video?
Right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. My name is David Rossi. Some of you may in fact know me by Dave Zed. I host and run the YouTube channel Generation Z, where we focus on a multitude of different aspects pertaining to the sciences, physics, all of that, you name it. But I'm also the founder and CEO of SALT LLC, which stands for Strategic Analysis and Assessment of Longitudinal Technologies. I'm extremely grateful, humbled, and delighted to be here, and I would like to state that before we move forward with this presentation, I would like to thank all of you for being understanding of this being a pre-recording, simply because I did in fact need approval for this presentation to be publicly presented. So the reason I call today's presentation A New Perspective on Old Physics is because I would dare to postulate that what we call classical mechanics or classical physics, whether theoretically the models on paper or in the laboratory, are by definition being put on notice by quantum mechanics, particularly in the different areas in which SED, stochastic electrodynamics, has found a way over the decades to merge a semi-classical concept of physics with a quantum unification, which has then ultimately led to the discussion of, stochastic electrodynamics being on its last leg, and that merging itself into the overall quantum unification of such. Hence why I call today's presentation A New Perspective on Old Physics, specifically focusing on mass, time, vacuum extractability, and quantum unification. Now, before starting this presentation, to give an overarching concept of more so the philosophical motivation behind this, is that according to Dr. Niels Bohr, there are trivial truths and then there are great truths. The opposite of a trivial truth is plainly false, but the opposite of a great truth is also true. What's interesting about this is that I find there to be a unique correlation between this particular quote, obviously the rest of the presentation that I'll be giving today, in addition to a claim that we could all potentially agree on here as people that are interested in the sciences in a multitude of areas, which is that a New York Times article from May 4th, 1935, over 100 years ago, discusses how Einstein attacks quantum theory because he finds it is not complete even though it is correct, which speaks again to what I just brought up a minute or two ago, this sort of mergence between a semi-classical model and a quantum unification, if there could be one, if at all. I'm claiming in today's presentation there in fact is, and there are a multitude of avenues to pursue in order to obtain a unification of such, or a sort of, I guess we could call theory of everything or unified field theory, whether in the laboratory or theoretically, both numbers and practicality. So, let's start very simply with basic Newtonian physics and, of course, the Lorentz force. We see here on our screen that all of you are familiar with the Lorentz force equation, in addition to the concept of being able to spark a charge proportional to acceleration in order to get an object to move in general. Hence why Newton correctly stated force equals mass times acceleration. Because when you apply a force or a charge proportional to acceleration, that object will in fact be able to move. Now, when that object is moved, however it is moved in the laboratory or in general or anything of the sort, right? What ends up happening is, according to a lot of people, whether it's Dr. Sarfati, Dr. Paez, Dr. Pudov, with the concepts of the vacuum and the super force and the 0-point energy, we see that there may in fact be vacuum fluctuations after this object is being moved. Vacuum fluctuations literally in what we would call empty space, which would denote the possibility of an ether. It is very similar to the energetic equivalent of putting a microphone to a speaker and getting a non-stop squeal. The particles generate the fields then, I guess we could say, collect the particle fluctuations and then quote-unquote spit out new or fresh particles, if you will. So it is one giant cosmological feedback system overall. As a matter of fact, I will say, without getting too ahead of myself, when looking, whether in the laboratory, but I will focus on the theoretical modeling and calculations, if one accounts for, even including a semi-classical model, whether it's Hamiltonian or Lagrangian functions, one can find that if one treats the vacuum or the 0-point fluctuation background as a real phenomena, if you will, the numbers begin to fall into place a lot more easier. With that said, I noticed some very peculiar similarities over the decades. As a matter of fact, even over the millennia. We see on the far left-hand side the infinity symbol, in which we are all familiar with. We see in the center part of our screen here, we see the Ouroboros, which seems to be quite reminiscent of the infinity symbol. And then on the far right-hand side, I would like to point your folks' attention to a presentation by Dr. Pudov, in which was conducted, I believe, I could be wrong here, but in Stockholm in the 1990s, where we see that even Dr. Pudov himself had claimed that the particles generate the fields allow the particles to fluctuate, and it's a constant giant cosmological feedback system, very similar to that of a toroid field. With that said, I would like to point out that I found a very peculiar historical pattern, particularly pertaining to the far left-hand side, which is one of Dr. Salvatore Paez's patents, in addition to the middle picture of on the screen here, which is from, I believe, the 1400s, when the Knights Templars were in ancient Egypt, approximately. And at the very bottom, we see here what I have not coined personally, but would call pine cones kissing, if you will, from ancient Samaria and Mesopotamia. Now, when we take these three images and we cross-reference them with the quantum viewpoint of the hydrogen wave function on the right-hand side, we find some very interesting similarities with respect to the visual geometries of such. Now, this then brings us to a postulation in which I am postulating that Newton's third law is wrong. In other words, for every action there is not a reaction so much as there is an anti-action. Anti, specifically meaning the ability to perturb and manipulate a consequence of an initial and or inertial action from the gauge symmetry point of view within the local metric of whatever one is effectuating or attempting to effectuate. Now the question then becomes, if so, what would these anti-actions be based on? I would like to point everyone very strongly to Dr. Pudov's paper, Electromagnetic Potentials Basis for Energy Density and Power Flux, particularly where he says here in his background discussion, quote, "Though little discussed, there exists a rich literature on alternative definitions of electromagnetic energy density and power flux, the general purpose of which has been to attempt to bring clarity to some of the ambiguities associated with the standard definitions," end quote. Again, what we're seeing here is that the potentials themselves The electromagnetic potentials are the foundation for this new type of energetic phenomenon, dare I say, allowing for COP, coefficient of performance over 1, to occur, not just in a power sense of being able to power the home, but perhaps even in a propulsion sense, and in many other areas as well, but we'll stick with propulsion and inertia for today's presentation, generally speaking. So one doesn't have to believe me or have to, listen precisely to what I'm saying or adequately, so much as one would need to even look at Richard Feynman's quotes, and we see here that the source of such quotations and lectures are cited accurately down below, and I quote, "In the general theory of quantum electrodynamics, one takes the vector and scalar potentials as the fundamental quantities in a set of equations that replace the Maxwell equations. The E and B fields, the electric and magnetic fields, are slowly disappearing from the modern expression of physical laws, and they are being replaced by A and phi, or again, the magnetic vector potential and the magnetic flux itself. As a matter of fact, fun little side note or side story, this is just a general approximation of the story, but when Richard Feynman and John Wheeler had found that the A field could in fact be separated from the B field, particularly within that of utilizing the del Krauss operator, it was thought, because of the amount of power extraction from the potentials, of which we see here Dr. Puthoff is arguing, that it was initially thought that the power, because of how, I guess you could say, extravagant it was, the output compared to the input, was vastly outdoing the input. And so it was thought initially that this was just an artifact of the mathematics. People thought, my gosh, it can't be possible, but it turns out that there's enough energy in the room that you are sitting in, theoretically, to evaporate all of the world's oceans, if you could get it all up in the room. But this is in fact feasible and has been calculated. Now, I would like to focus particularly on the Lamb shift. Willis Lamb was awarded the Nobel Prize for showcasing that the vacuum's alteration, and to be specific, when I say the vacuum, I say the ether, I'm speaking of what we'd call empty space. The vacuum's alteration of the energy level of an electron resides within the hydrogen atom, which is interesting because the difference in energy frequency units, or the bandwidth, if you will, is a very particular number in the megahertz range, which is something I would like everyone to very kindly keep in mind. And the energy density of such exceeds that of the sun's surface, which speaks to the idea that if it could be extracted, if this power could be extracted via mechanisms like the Lamb shift or Casimir effect or van der Waals forces or anything like this, the numbers seem to substantiate the ability to, attain such vast amounts of power. Now, the question then becomes, could this be used practically? Could it be extracted for practical use? Such may imply, when I mean such, I'm speaking to the Lamb shift concept, that when the vectors are summed to zero, both theoretically and in the laboratory, the potentials become more quote-unquote real than the fields themselves, due to making something real, quote-unquote, from nothing, or from empty space, which ideally would speak to the concept of as above, so below philosophically. It would speak to this idea of, again, order from chaos, something from nothing, generally speaking, merging physics with metaphysics, and I will be more specific, I assure you. And I also would like to state that I agree very avidly and strongly with Dr. Sal Paez when he says that science without philosophy is like a seed without water. Now, when the vectors are summed to zero, such may allow for thermodynamic manipulation, perturbation, and extraction from the vacuum for practical use purposes. This then suggests, as I had previously mentioned, that the A field, the magnetic vector potential field, can be separated from the B field, theoretically using that of the del Krauss operator, which allows for integral relativistic implementations of the Dirac equation in 3D without runaways. I would like to very kindly point to the work of people like Dr. Rueda, Dr. Bernache, forgive me, the names off the top of my head, Dr. Puthoff, Dr. Sarfati, Dr. Davis, many others, I will say. Forgive me if I have not mentioned all the names in which I feel I am obligated to give credit to. Now, To my knowledge, this is where things get interesting. No Western university has calculated the magnitude of a potential. Which is interesting. The question becomes why? I think it's because if one goes to read the original papers, circa mid to late 1800s, not what someone wrote about the papers, but the actual original sources, Gibbs, Heaviside, Maxwell, Lorentz, Poynting, we will find that even the standard Poynting theorem, of which is generally all of our engineering models are based off of today, in practicality as well, the standard Poynting theorem denotes that a potential is infinite and reaches out far way past the wire. So for example, if electricity does not run through the copper wire, it hugs the wire. And then the magnitude of the potential is literally infinite. It stretches out way past the wire. So, at best, maybe I'm incorrect here, but at best, I could only find within the Western universities that potential intensity is accounted for, which is interesting because that is very different than the magnitude of a potential. Again, potential intensity seems to be calculated in the textbooks that I have read upon researching for this presentation today, based off of an intensity of a potential that is just based off of an arbitrary unit point charge, randomly stuck in empty space as they call it. But even in that regard, the standard Poynting theorem speaks to this concept of the potential being infinite, going way past the wire. So, we can see some of this substantiated in regards to a theoretical modeling, which is of course Dr. Pudov's polarizable vacuum theory, particularly the second paragraph where, quote, we see that accompanying the usual Lorentz force is an additional dielectric force proportional to the gradient of the vacuum dielectric constant, which would speak to this idea of curvature in loop quantum gravity, right? Particularly the work of Dr. Carlo Rovelli and the tracing within loop quantum gravity, as well as the concept that this curvature of space-time may speak to a larger state of unification. Not only that, but we see, and I quote, the usual Lorentz force is an additional dielectric force proportional to the gradient of the vacuum dielectric constant. This proportionality seems to be substantiating that, or at least being able to ascertain the veracity of a unified field theory with respects to what we had looked at earlier about the particles generate the fields allow the particles to fluctuate, so on and so forth. Now, you may say, Dave, this is all fine and dandy talk, but do we have any evidence for this? Well, I was able to obtain a 1999 Popular Mechanics article called Taming Gravity. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with Dr. Ning Li specifically, and of course we all, there's been a lot of rumors and speculation as to, I believe she has since passed away, may she rest in peace, but as to what her work was doing ever since the late 90s, up until her passing. What's interesting, however, is that, again, I am quoting the Popular Mechanics article, speaking to the manipulation of mass, and I quote, basically you are adding a couple of vectors to zero it out or enhance it, to zero gravity out or enhance it, end quote. These are not my words, these are the words of Dr. Larry Smalley, the former chairman of the University of Alabama at Huntsville Physics Department. The question then becomes, after the vectors are summed to zero, as we've seen in our previous slides and images that seem to be reminiscent of a lot of ancient, we could say, cave drawings, scriptures, descriptions, you name it, what does this say about mass in general? Manipulating mass seems to be able to show that this allows for a negation or attraction of particle distribution fluctuations. Very similar to waves within a body of water, or I will give a more practical example when you are changing the bed sheets of your bed, literally, as you're planning to wash them. As you pull the blankets off the bed, there's sort of that wave propagation, exact same movement. This allows for the manipulation of the relative perception of local time, local space, and the local objects within that space-time metric. Of course, in correspondence with other metric variabilities, but just to keep it simple for the sake of this presentation. Manipulating mass also denotes a correlation between the speed of light, angular acceleration, angular momentum, angular velocity, and how such is perceived across time, which speaks to this concept of, again, superdeterminism and many other things. How is this done theoretically? It is done by manipulating epsilon and mu, the vacuum permittivity and the vacuum permeability, or the electric permittivity and magnetic permeability. Very simple in that particular regard. Now, you may say, Dave, that's all fine and dandy, but do we have a practical example? Absolutely. So, say we have a laboratory, right? And the laboratory is split into two rooms with a wall dividing it down the center. One side of the laboratory is in fact a glass prism, where laser beams outside of the prism are shooting into the glass prism. The other half of the laboratory is just simply an observational room for to observe and obtain the data and all of this. So once laser beams are shot into the prism, particularly multiple different beams, what happens is the laser beam begins to curve within the gradients of the prism via that of the kinetic, photonic, and phononic oscillations. Now what happens is the curvature inside of that glass prism, if there were to be someone or something inside that prism in the laboratory, in the first half of the room, you would see sort of a rainbow-like effect in addition to a potential Davies-Unruh thermal bath effect, if you will, right? Now, the laboratory observer not in the prism is only going to see the flat curvature of that energetic phenomenon relative to the other side of the laboratory. He is not going to see that phenomenon in 3D, let alone 4D, 5D, all the way up to 12 space. He is not going to see or experience that phenomenon in curved space-time. He or she is only going to see the flat curvature and intersection of that phenomenon. Now, this then makes us ask, okay, what does this say about empty space and our earlier discussed potentials? It says that they have the ability, as I just mentioned, to become an active local quote-unquote engine. Literally anywhere where there's what we'd call empty space has the ability to become a local engine via oscillatory concepts and approaches, one of them being ER equals EPR, the Einstein-Rosenberg model. Such can in fact be traced in loop quantum gravity. Again, particularly Dr. Carlo Rovelli and his team's work on, I believe, quantum split sources. For anyone willing to discuss that, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly, and I love talking about those concepts within loop quantum gravity. Such can be traced via delta T variables in optics, which is interesting. It brings us back to that correlation between mass, speed of light. We see something happening here. Now, what's interesting is that on the left-hand side, we have an ATIP DIA file, which shows, particularly the second half of the paragraph, an inter-universe wormhole image at the top and an intra-universe wormhole at the bottom. But I would like to quote that Hochberg and Visser proved that it is only the behavior near the wormhole throat that is critical to understanding the physics, and that a generic throat can be defined without having to make all of the symmetry assumptions, and without assuming the existence of an asymptotically flat spacetime in which to embed the wormhole, end quote. Which is very, very peculiar, because it speaks to this idea of, again, the pine cones kissing. If one can understand the tip of such pine cones kissing, as we looked at some of the images prior, whether modern or ancient, we will find that there seems to be an understanding of just knowing what the tip's geometrical values and functions are, and limits, and symmetries. We can then integrate it exponentially to the rest of that wormhole in a Lorentz propagative sense, excuse me. What I mean by this essentially is that if we were to look at a paper by Dr. Ibison and Dr. Pudov on the Lorentz 3D Dirac we could say, integral relativistic 3D Lorentz-Dirac equation without runaways. I'm paraphrasing that paper, forgive me, but we will find that you can in fact implement the Dirac equation without it having runaways in an integrated relativistic form, which is very, very peculiar, particularly when we notice that over here on the right-hand side of our Wikipedia page, again, noticing here when we're looking at physical optics, there are, and I quote, there are different forms of the pointing vector. The most common are in terms of the E, B, or E and H fields. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the far right-hand side, and end quote, you will see that delta T in the dimension section is dealt with quite avidly. So you don't have to believe me again in this particular regard. Now, with that said, we will also find that the Poynting vector seems to be the most standard common usage. But even as I said earlier, the Poynting vector shows that the energy propagation expands way past the wire in which the energy is occurring on. The magnitude is infinite. Same thing with the field, by the way. Now, the question then becomes, if we're following Hochberg and Visser's approach here with respects to Dr. Puthoff and many, many others, the wormhole throat behavior may in fact propagate what we call time. This inertial frame of time is propelled from the zero or starting point of the vector summations. So we see on the left-hand side image that the 0 point, literally the coordinate where it says 0, the very bottom right of the left-hand side image, is the beginning of a gradient's curvature, as Dr. Puthoff's polarizable vacuum paper showed, that is, again, proportional to the propagation of this vacuum dielectric constant, of which the speed of light also seems to be proportional to as well. Now, those within the field of this energetic phenomenon would experience wormhole throat behavior very differently than that of those external to the field, very similar to the prism example we had given earlier. Now, you may say again, Dave, this is all fine and dandy talk, but what are some ways of practicality and using such vacuum energy to be extracted in the laboratory? Well, one way is a charged plate collapse. Now, for propulsion or inertial uses, it's not practical. As a matter of fact, I believe this was a proposition brought forward many decades ago by Dr. Robert Forward, I believe at Hughes Laboratory, under the Air Force Research Laboratory. I could be incorrect about AFRL there, but his whole hypothesis was, well, if I bring a bunch of stacked plates together, aluminum plates, and I charge them electrically, because of the Casimir and van der Waals forces and effect, the energy could be extracted from in between the plates, and then we can store that energy for use. Now, for propulsion and inertia, it's not practical. But it does lead to many other things like what we now know to be flat panel displays and many other things of the sort. The reason it's not practical is because it takes far more energy to induce an effect on the plates being charged compared to what you would extract from the effect in between the plates. A second variation, of which seems to be far more feasible, is a plasma punch or pulse. Basically, guys, a very high-tech version of rubbing your feet on the carpet and touching a doorknob to get a jolt or a shock, right? You can also pulse certain mechanisms with respects to these plasma oscillations and resonances and what have you. But another way, for those interested in work with liquids and water, is a sonoluminescence angle. Again, light and liquid, where very fast turbulent fluids with bubbles in the fluid collapse the bubbles due to, again, the zero vector pressure force. The vectors are being summed to zero. Every time one bubble collapses, and that wave collapses, if you will, you get 100,000 photons in 50 picoseconds from one tiny little light burst. So this is a very, very, very big effect. This is not some small stuff. Now, various other practical forms are indeed feasible as well, in which do not, in my opinion, both based on theoretical modeling and experiments in the laboratory, in which would not require superconductors or metamaterials. I have nothing against them. I just want to show in this particular presentation that superconductors or metamaterials are not necessarily always needed, in my humble opinion. But again, that's just me. Now, the current issues or concerns, because again, we can talk about how this is all great, but how can we address it, and then how can we help resolve or solve it? The current issues or concerns are that anything utilizing the U1 models, whether it's in classical electrodynamics, whether it's in chemistry, whether it's in optics, you name it, the U1 models across academia will not work because they assume a flat space-time. So numerically they will fall apart. This also speaks to the laboratory observer with the prism example. The scientist who is not in the glass prism is only seeing the flat curvature of that energetic phenomenon, which the U1 model will show, but that's the limit. That's it. So the U1 model assumes a flat spacetime which disallows and prevents seamless lattice ion angular integration into the space-time metric, of which could be calculated again with Ricci tensors, Hermitian operators, and many, many other tensors as well, just to give some idea for those that are on the theoretical side of things. Now, again, we addressed the problems and concerns. Let's take a look at some of the solutions. Some of the solutions I would propose would be SU2 group symmetry, particularly Dr. Miguel Javier, I believe out of MIT, but I could be wrong as to that particular university. In addition to E.T. Whittaker's 1903 and 1904 infolding paper as well. I would very strongly advise people to look at that. Of course, Richard Feynman's scattering operators. And very specifically, these last 2 points, I'd like to give an example for the chemists, or for those interested in more so in chemistry, to pursue a concept of stabilized disequilibrium, both in propulsion, but I'm going to use a chemist example here. So when people say for example, there's an energetic phenomenon, and they see some type of sulfuric acid, they think, or some type of what's been called, sort of gooey spider web, it's been called sometimes, angel hair, if you will. A lot of people say, oh, that's just sulfuric acid. I would beg to differ. Why do I beg to differ? Well, say in the laboratory, practically, we have an acid and we have a hydroxide, and we neutralize the two. It is normally known, particularly within the U1 models, as it's been taught to all of us, that during the neutralization of these two chemicals, the acid and the hydroxide, there is supposed to be a heat coming from that neutralization. In other words, there is supposed to be an exothermic reaction. But in this particular case, there isn't. So that tells us there are some peculiar properties within this particular acid and particular hydroxide that allows for disequilibrium to become stabilized in conditions where it normally would not be stable. So that's why when people say, oh, look, that's just sulfuric acid, I don't think so. There are some peculiar properties that are creating a situation where, again, disequilibrium could be stabilized. Now, SU2 group symmetry as well allows for the space-time peak across the local metric to occur. So the left-hand side image, we have a space-time metric, generally speaking, for those that are more visual. And on the right-hand side, for our visual friends again, we have a sort of, I guess you could say, peak in which would occur from the metric once certain conditions are met. Now, there may in fact be a potential longitudinal lock-in with these transverse waves. So again, if we were to focus on the glass prism example in the laboratory, the experiencer inside of the glass prism, or this energetic phenomenon, would experience something of what we're looking at right over here. In addition to, again, a possible Davies-Unruh thermal bath effect, but this would be the visual. Now, the external observer, of which I believe to be the case in which much of the literature today in quantum field theory, loop quantum gravity, SU2 group symmetry, is showcasing the viewpoint of the external observer. The external observer would see something like this. Not necessarily the entire template here, but I'm speaking more to just, again, a flat intersection curvature where the blue shift, red shift begins to, create more of a propagative effect that Dr. Pudov and many others with respects to space-time metric engineering have discussed, where, again, sort of like if we took a bed sheet on one's bed and just kind of whipped it up, would be the same way in which when the space-time metric is voided, after the vectors are summed to zero, what then happens is there's a sudden blue shift in energy in the thermal spectrum. Because, sort of like when you are unzipping, for example, the jean pocket pants or something of this type, the jean material itself moves aside for that, we could say phenomenon to then occur. And in this particular example, the jean material, like clothing, would represent the space-time metric. So, some thoughts would be that would light propagation and time have direct correlations? Does the manipulation of local objects' masses perturb or effectuate such phenomenology within that of the local metric? And does time exist within photonic and phononic resonance and propagation? These are some thoughts that I think should be or could be avidly explored. Now, I would like to thank truth be told, people from the APEC community, folks from that I've spoken to privately, whether from DoD or otherwise, or from even around the world, for providing a tremendous insight into angular geodesic acceleration, which would allow for such energetic phenomenon to occur. And when I say energetic phenomenon, I'm speaking to a multitude of different potentialities, not just for propulsion. Now, we have the four known forces, as we know. We have the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. The question becomes, is there in fact a missing key, particularly within general relativity? If we were to follow along Einstein's concept and, given the Schwarzschild metric and all of this metric solution, is there a fifth force that unifies the other four? Maybe there's more than a fifth force, maybe there's multiple forces or multiple integrative approaches. And not only that, but are there multiple ways of tapping and or accessing this fifth force? That becomes another very avid question I think could be pursued based on the previous slides I have presented, and or of course interpretations from folks in the audience and your own thoughts as well. Now, I would dare to say, this is my humble opinion, multiple avenues towards the same undergird or underlying source would be Dr. Pudov's zero-point energy, of course, and his papers, Dr. Salvatore Paez's superforce, Dr. Sarfati's EVOs, exotic vacuum objects, and of course Existics from our great friend and APEC community member Gavin. I would like to thank our friend Gavin for coming forward in the way that he did, particularly in the APEC WhatsApp group chat, for helping others in the community understand and explain his concept of Existics and how it could be unified both with classical models and in many other ways as well. I do not mean to speak for Mr. Gavin, but I'd like to thank you, Gavin, for coming forward with your Existics. It's a fantastic model in my opinion. Now, again, we are speaking to the different avenues of which this source could be tapped. Now, there are in fact in the laboratory multiple avenues of extraction, energetic selection of frequencies, etc., which would be high frequencies, low frequencies, and potentially unknown frequencies and bandwidths both above and below the current electromagnetic spectrum and the thermal artifact, particularly dealing with the thermal artifact more so on the lower levels of the thermal artifact, in addition to acoustic ranges and auditory phenomena, if we'd like to call it such. A practical example of a theoretical concept or situation where, again, I'm trying to push the limits here a little bit deliberately, in the sense of, we see that out of the Institute of Electron Physics, the Ukraine National Academy of Sciences, some tremendous people put out a paper on the essence of SGME, which stands for Slightly Generalized Maxwellian Equations. What's interesting is that after the paper was released, the paper had talked about dismissing the Dirac equation for a moment. There seemed to be to allow for more of a unified model with respects to Mr. Krivsky and Simolkik's work. But the paper was immediately attacked. This is where it gets interesting, because the paper and the authors were attacked, but the equations themselves were not debunked nor calculated to show any other derivation that would suggest an incorrect or incomplete unification of the slightly generalized Maxwell equations. So it gets interesting, right? We see, for example, that people will attack papers, but not necessarily say, okay, here's the math to show why it can't work, right? Now, one thing I'd like to also bring up before ending off this presentation is some of my own work, some papers that I have written myself as well. I do need approval for release on these papers, so if anyone is interested in obtaining them, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly at genzpodcast@gmail.com, but I still am waiting for approval. So if you email me now, I will have to tell you that you'll have to wait a little bit, but these are just some papers that I've put together for various groups and individuals, and also, truth be told, other papers that of which I cannot showcase for certain world governments and other departments of DoD and so forth. So, with that said, I'd like to thank you all so very much for watching and listening to today's presentation. I hope this provided a little bit more of an insight into really going back to the basics of Lagrangian and Newtonian physics, and then trying to, I guess we could say, understand such from there, whether theoretically, and then of course bringing it into the laboratory, and then being scaled for commercial and consumer use.
Let me take it. You know what? So very first thing here, let me put this thing in gallery mode. Everybody give Mr. Dave Rossi an enormous hand. Wonderful presentation, very in depth. Man, this is why I love recording this, because you ran through a ton of stuff. Folks asked if the slide deck is available. If you want, you can. I mean, if you feel comfortable, if you want to upload that, you can put that into chat. Otherwise, folks can go through, again, all the slides you presented. These are going to be on our YouTube channel. They'll be on our website at altpropulsion.com. And, you know, again, just to let everybody know, what we're doing is, I mean, we have, especially for new folks here, we have a massive archive. I mean, this is 47 conference sessions. They average 8 hours each. You know, each one has like 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 presentations. And then the open discussion in chat, there's just brilliance all through that, you know, and that's just APEC, right? And like then Jeremy Reese, who live streams these, if you haven't seen Jeremy's Alien Scientist channel, I mean, he has been doing this for like 15 years, you know, he's got thousands and thousands of videos on all sorts of different topics. So let me do this. Let me go to Q&A session because we have some time here. So I think Mark had, sorry, my chat's getting in the way there. I'll let participants unmute themselves now. So questions for Mr. Dave Rossi. Let me go to Mark Fiorentino first. Mark?
Okay, thank you. Hey, did you say that the Department of Defense has had to approve your speaking here today? Did I get that?
That particular file, the video we watched, yes, sir.
Why would that have to be?
What I can say is that tapping this type of energy is a lot simpler than people may think, and they wanted to make sure I didn't let things slip. I've let stuff slip in the past in other presentations.
Well, how did you get involved with the Department of Defense?
Basically, long story short, about a year and change ago, so I had started my YouTube channel about 2.5 years ago, just pursuing, you know, life sciences, all that kind of stuff, and then started looking into 0-point energy. And I just said to myself about a year ago, why not try it out myself? And I can tell you guys that with a couple $1,000 saved up, a few Amazon orders, some trips to the hardware store and what have you, I created something that enacted this effect. After this effect occurred, it basically, because of the way, it does not break any laws of physics, but because of how strong this, had I Faraday caged this particular, I call it generator, then they would not have picked it up. But basically I was messing with you know, old microwaves and lasers and things like this, but even that wasn't needed. But basically it set off detectors, and then I started getting emails from people, DARPA, Naval War College, what have you, and then I word got around to certain people, presented to very high level people, and then from there I started a company, Salt, and then was yeah, basically just took it from there. Just exploring. Went to a few different laboratories to provide proof of concept demonstration, and yeah.
What was the concept you were proving exactly?
Specifically what we would call electrogravitics, a direct correlation between mass and inertia.
So you're claiming you created an anti-gravity machine?
I don't really like to call it anti-gravity so much as negating. It's not anything unique to what I've tapped. I'm sure I guarantee people have done it far before me. I don't claim anything unique. It was more so just the way that I unified it, both when I presented and then when I did showed proof of concept in the lab.
It's a shame you didn't get into the details of that.
Unfortunately, the reason, guys, and I want to tell all of you right now, is because it's actually a lot simpler than many may think. Now, there are many different ways of doing it, which is why I'm not saying I've cracked the way. I've just cracked a set of ways, but it's a lot simpler than people may think, than many may think, with respects to mass and inertia having direct correlations. At first I thought it was like wind, you know. I was experimenting outside, then I brought it inside, and then, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then once it was done in the lab, I was like, okay, So, and then I could tell even I had presented to certain departments before even doing proof of concept, and even during the presentation, certain individuals, their faces, I could tell they were like, oh shit. So that's,
Do you
yeah.
think they will ever give you permission to talk about this?
Truth be told, it's I hope within the next couple of years, honestly. If not, yeah.
All right.
Because it's considered national security. It's the same thing that same concept that Dr. Paez said to Kurjai Mungal when he said he had to stop at a certain point for national security issues. It's the same concept, same angle.
Okay. Well, Mark, thank you, sir. Let me see. Oh, he just burped from my screen. Oh, because his hand went down. Let me go to Mr. William Alec next.
Yeah, Tim, can you hear me?
Yeah. You know what? I need to put hands down after you guys start. In Zoom, you disappear when I put the hand down in the. Okay. Yeah, go for it, Bill.
Okay, your guest, his name is Dave.
Yes, sir.
Zed, is that correct?
Well,
Rossi. Zed was
Rossi?
the channel
Dave?
name. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Brilliant lecture, by the way.
Thank you, sir.
I saw some parallels though with Tom Bearden's work from about, I don't know, 20 years ago. And he brought up, some of the same papers you brought up. And, today, we're working with a simplified version of the Maxwell equations.
Right.
And the issue with that, is the simplification. And it goes back to the original the original Maxwell equations, which were done in this quaternion math solution.
Right.
And according to Tom's work, and of course, I was fortunate to be there, at his lectures 20 years ago, and spoke with him personally on this subject. And he spoke quite frequently of what are called scalar waves. Okay, and it's scalar electromagnetics, and that, according to Tom, that's really the key to gravity and anti-gravity control, working with scalar electromagnetics, is the key to this thing. And what it is, it's not fusion. Fusion is like an extreme version of working with these scalar functions, where you take two particles and you just crash them, combine them together. And you don't have to do that. The objective here is to create the scalar function just by oscillating or resonating two particles together. Okay. And Tom referred to it as a Q cross Q function. And the output of this Q cross Q function, when you resonate these two particles together, the output of that is a sine squared function. And you actually see that on scope traces, okay, the sine squared function. And that sine squared embodies your scalar function, okay? And that's what gets you to scalar electromagnetics. And Tom, he was really into the, gravity and anti-gravity control. And so this function just relates to this oscillating function, which I don't know, I've been able to replicate it quite easily using the technology that I have here. And so, really it was coming down to Tom Bearden's lectures, that I saw a parallel, with what you were speaking about. Okay. So, I just wanted to mention that a key to this thing is not achieving fusion, but kind of like the halfway in between point of where you take these two particles and you force them together and you oscillate them, creating a scalar function. Okay, and that's what gets you to this over unity and this type of electromagnetics, which taps into these potentials that you were talking about or speaking about here. So I just wanted to mention that.
I want to thank you so much, sir, for bringing up Mr. Bearden. I've read his work. I've watched his videos, his lectures, his presentations. I would have loved to meet him myself, and I think that there's definitely respectfully to everybody here, I have to just watch my words a little bit, but there might be something there. That's what I could say. If I may also very quickly address the I believe our friend Mark from previously, one of the reasons, guys, that I want to be able to say to demonstrate how I did it in a practical sense, but unfortunately cannot, is because basically let's just say I call it the generator. I call it when it's in its vertical position, it immediately gives immediate inertia right away. However, with a few adjustments, maybe 20-30 minutes worth of adjustments, and then just tilting it horizontally, it becomes weaponizable, and it becomes a rail gun, or EMP. It puts firearms out of business, which is why, again, if anyone can tap that in that particular regard, it becomes I get put in a lot of trouble in a legal regard. So I just want to be a little bit more clear in that sense. But with respects to Mr. Bearden's work, sir, William, I think that there's a lot of potential with vector scalar potentials and the oscillations and the resonances of that. And then that's what I was trying to say with by summing the vectors to zero. So I would,
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, because Tom mentioned that there's an engine, a vacuum engine that forms, when you have this zero vector that has all this internal structure to it, and it doesn't show up in any of the conventional Maxwell equations.
I agree.
You have to use an extreme form of this, which is the quaternion math, and then the scalar vectors begin to emerge from all that.
Right, I would agree. If I could also politely, even I don't consider myself a lecturer or anything like this, although I appreciate the compliment. I find, guys, the more that I experiment in the laboratory, the more I realize I don't know anything, to tell you the truth. But I would recommend very respectfully to look at not what someone, as I said in the presentation, has written about the original Heaviside, Lorentz, Gibbs, Maxwell papers, even the Poynting papers, but to do your best to try and find the original source papers. There's a very significant difference, because the many of the academics today, not to take any jabs at them, but they don't really go back to bother to read the original papers, because they think that the perfect job was done when it really arguably wasn't. So that's kind of then we get into the whole, for those that are more into the conspiring of, JP Morgan and Tesla and all that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Well, Tesla did that as well. Okay, and his magnifying transformer,
Yes,
he set up these opposing forces, and virtually no physicist knows anything about that.
But this is what I was trying to convey with the vectors to zero.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the key to it.
I would agree. This is simply one way that I would approach in probably about 5-6 different ways that I found to be the case, whether it's with just electricity and certain types of magnets, things like this, or even with liquids, like with ferromagnetic fluids and things like that. But yes, either way, there is a vector summing to zero, pine cones kissing. And I found it's interesting.
Yeah, that's the whole key to this thing.
I mean, maybe I'm going nuts here, but I found an interesting pattern over the ages of what our ancestors seem to have been trying to say with that same vector summing to zero. Now, maybe I could be dead wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a number of researchers that that spoke about this. This zero vectoring concept.
Right. Absolutely. The pine cone, Toby, sir, sorry, Tim, I'll let you moderate the questions, but the pine cone just meaning basically like the vectors, where there's like a pyramid type, starts with a broad base and then narrows its way up. You'll find that even in bio nanoelectronics and the even papers written by people like Charles Lieber from even a decade ago, they speak about that as well. A sort of resonant electrical occurrence that goes within the sort of, you know, also it starts to oscillate at the bottom, and the reason it needs to be sort of a pine cone or, you know, triangle in shape is because the resonance needs to eventually squeeze right through the top, and it can't be done if it's got a broad base essentially, but it needs that broad base to build up its resonance. So
Yeah. Well, let me go to, if it's okay, we got about 5 minutes until the top of the hour. Let me go to Jared real quick. And Bill, thank you, sir.
Dave, outstanding lecture. Outstanding.
thank you, sir. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. Clarification question first. When you were talking about the Lamb shift of the hydrogen, and that's one of the areas where you might be able to tap into something.
Yeah.
Are you referring to like conversion of the virtual particles into real particles through like significantly high energy densities? Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, when I had said that the potentials may be more quote unquote real than the fields themselves. Yeah. And then separating the magnetic vector potential, the A field from the B field. Yes, precisely.
Gotcha. And then just two other questions regarding the stuff that you can't talk about. So whatever light you could shed on it.
Sure.
For your successful experiments, were solitons or standing waves, you know, the buildup of energy in a location, is that playing any part in your experiment?
Potentially,
okay. Also, the quality factor of it, right? How many cycles you're getting for your thing, which goes hand in hand with the Salton. Did that need to be significantly high, or you say you can get it all with off the shelf, easy attainable stuff?
it didn't have to be. I can tell you that one of the first experiments I had done, I had placed an object over the generator, and it went about 3 kilometers vertically up, like immediate inertia.
When you say immediately up, like, can you give any estimate as to the amount of acceleration it had? Like how fast it went off?
I honestly, man, I'm gonna have to get back to you. If you want, I can put my email in. I have to be I have to be vigilant with specifics. Forgive me, guys. I'm not trying to you know, say it, you know, I can't comment on things or whatever. I just have to be careful. I really wish I could, you know, blurt it all out, but I'll put my email here for anyone that's interested.
Excellent. I already messaged your Instagram to try to get some papers from you.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
We might be able to correspond through there.
Okay.
And final aspect of it, plasmonics, is that playing any role in it?
Oh, plasmas or plasma? I've said
plasmonics.
Not initially, but you can introduce that. The more creativity you have, the more you can play around with it.
Okay.
So, okay, wonderful. Let me go to Jared. Thank you, sir. Let me go to Taylor Cisco. We got about a minute and a half left. Taylor, go for it, sir.
Oh, he's muted.
Yeah, and actually, that's okay. Oh, Taylor, let me ask you. There we go.
There we go. I'm very impressed with the your comprehensive survey of metrics and such. Out of curiosity, did you read the works or review the works done by either Burkhard Heim or by Boyko Ivanov?
Yes.
Both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The way you're smiling, I assume Boyko Ivanov might have been interesting.
There, like I've said, I'm not the first one to have tapped this.
Oh, what a dance. Another question. When you activate your device or when you activate whatever, after you do your charging or activation, do you need to continue activating to generate a force? Can you just get a force without continued activation or energizing?
An occasional pulsation is needed.
But after that, it's kind of in a state of generating a force.
That's it. It pulls from what we call empty space. If you want to just have something levitate or negate the local field, the metric, it'll pull it from empty space. But if you're talking for movement, an occasional pulsation is needed.
All right, and one more question, if I can squeeze it in. Does some of the phenomena seem to be compatible with a preferred reference frame?
Absolutely.
Uh-oh. That's interesting.
It's truly, this is where I say I agree with Dr. Paez when he says it's merging the world of the very large with the world of the very small, in the sense that it truly depends on the individual that is observing. That's why I tried to give that prism example with one lab observer not in the prism and then one in.
Well, I mean, what I'm getting at too is that the kind of physics you guys are playing with you in the Department of Defense, if you're looking at stuff that's compatible with a preferred reference frame, I would assume, are looking at some interesting phenomena, even some of it that might even border on being like tachyons or whatever.
It becomes, I will say, this is just my opinion, but with some of the things I've seen in the laboratory, it's truly the energies are beautiful. It becomes indiscernible from what one could call, I say this very carefully, but quote unquote magic. It's a very beautiful thing. So that's why I speak so much on the philosophical side as well.
Awesome.
Oh, very good.
Okay.
I won't ask any more questions. I think I have an idea of what you guys are excited about.
Well, and Taylor, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, and so what I guess let me do this before anything else. Again, I want to put this thing back on gallery view. Everyone, Dave Zed.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Dave Rossi. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. Dave, if you're able to maybe drop your email, or if you have some contact info, if you could drop that into chat, and then people
Sure.
can follow up with you directly if they have more questions. Because I did see, I mean, there was a lot of interest there. And then in the meantime, what I would like to do is go to Mr. Jeremy Reese, who is, let me see, I will ask him to unmute. And so
I just want to say Jeremy's the reason why I was even able to come here and all that. So Jeremy, thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Dave, too. And that was I'm so glad you came on today, man. That was an epic presentation, and I think I think we're on the right track here, and I think there's going to be a lot going on. I'm going to connect a lot of stuff from the first two presentations here.
Well, and Jeremy, if it's okay, let me introduce this first, because so I think everybody here knows Jeremy Reese, right? He's been with this conference since the very beginning. And, I mean, he deserves so much credit. He's live streamed things. He has participated. He's done presentations. He did earlier I believe it was earlier in the year, or last year, he did a major UAP phenomena overview, right? And again, one of the things that Jeremy is known for throughout the internet is being able to condense and synthesize massive amounts of data into something that makes a lot of sense. So he did a presentation on that. And I have been pestering him for 6 months now to represent this because he's updated it. So